The air in The Groggy Seal was a thick, breathing thing, a composite atmosphere of stale beer, salt, and the faint, metallic tang of diesel that clung to the docks of Naval Base Coronado. It was a place built of dark wood, brass fixtures tarnished by sea mist, and an almost religious reverence for the men who drank there. The walls were a museum of silent professionals, faded photographs of SEAL teams in faraway deserts and jungles, paddles from BUD/S classes long since graduated, and plaques bearing the names of the fallen. It was less a bar and more a shrine, a decompression chamber for men who lived their lives at the crushing pressure of operational depth. In this sanctuary, hierarchy was fluid, replaced by a more primal currency of reputation and combat experience. And in this specific corner of this specific sanctuary, Lieutenant Commander Michael Raptor Jensen held court. He was not a physically gargantuan man, but he occupied space as if he were. His presence was an exercise in controlled expansion, his shoulders broad, his posture a declaration of ownership over the worn leather booth and the table scarred by 1,000 careless beer bottles. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself. A strong jaw, eyes that seemed to squint even in the dim light, and a mouth perpetually set in a half-smirk that broadcast a deep and abiding satisfaction with his place in the universe. He was a SEAL team leader, a victor of multiple deployments, and he wore his unearned confidence like a second skin. Authority radiated from him not like heat from a furnace, but like the aggressive chill of a freezer door left open, daring anyone to close it. He laughed, a loud, percussive bark that cut through the low hum of conversation, and the men of his team, a collection of younger, harder versions of himself, laughed with him. Their laughter was a territorial marker, a sonic fence around their section of the bar. It was a space earned in their minds through sweat, blood, and the shared trauma of combat. It was not for outsiders. It was certainly not for the woman. She sat alone at a small two-person table just at the edge of their unofficial territory. She had been there for perhaps an hour, a fixture of stillness in a room of restless energy. She was unremarkable. That was the first and only word that came to mind. Her hair was a nondescript brown, pulled back in a simple, functional tie. She wore civilian clothes, dark, practical trousers, and a plain gray sweater that did nothing to suggest a shape beneath it. She was neither old nor young, occupying that indeterminate age where life had smoothed away the sharp edges of youth, but had not yet begun to carve the deep lines of seniority. She nursed a single glass of water, condensation tracing clean paths down its side. She was not reading. She was not looking at her phone. She was simply sitting, observing the room with a placid neutrality that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any overt sign of discomfort. Her posture was perfect, a straight line from her lower back to the crown of her head, a study in ergonomic discipline. She was an anomaly, a gray rock in a river of boisterous, khaki-clad currents, and her quiet presence had begun to grate on Lieutenant Commander Jensen's nerves like sand in a well-oiled machine. He watched her over the rim of his glass. She was an accountant, maybe. A logistics clerk from the base supply depot, lost and looking for a different, tamer establishment. Or perhaps a scholar, a historian from some university doing a sociological study of military culture. The thought made him sneer internally. He had seen her type before, the academic tourists who wanted to catalog and dissect men like him, to put them under a microscope and label their parts without ever understanding the whole. They used words like hyper-masculinity and tribalism, sterile terms for the sacred bonds that kept men alive when the world was trying its utmost to kill them. Her stillness was an affront. It was a judgment. It was the quiet condescension of the intellectual looking upon the beast in its cage. "Hey, Raptor." One of his men, a young petty officer named Corman, leaned in. "Who's the civvy? She been here a while." Jensen didn't take his eyes off her. "Don't know, don't care. Probably some bean counter from PersCom who took a wrong turn." He took a long pull of his beer. "Looks like she's calculating the structural integrity of the bar stool." The other men chuckled. The woman did not react. She did not flinch. She did not turn. It was as if their words were a frequency she was incapable of hearing. This, more than anything, stoked the embers of his irritation into a small, hot flame. It was one thing to be an outsider. It was another to be so willfully oblivious to the established order of things. She was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, and the sheer audacity of her calm was an insult that demanded a response. He needed to reassert the natural order. He drained his bottle, slamming it down on the table with a crack that made his own men jump. The woman's gaze flickered towards the sound for a fraction of a second, a bare acknowledgement, before returning to the middle distance. That was it. That was the final straw. The jackal had danced, and the lioness had not even bothered to twitch an ear. He rose from the booth, his movements slow, deliberate, a predator uncoiling. The low chatter of his team died away, replaced by the electric anticipation of a confrontation. They knew their leader. They knew the signs. This was part of the ritual, the casual assertion of dominance that was as much a part of their culture as cleaning their weapons. He sauntered over to her table, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He did not stand before her. He stood over her, casting her in his shadow. "Ma'am," he began, the word dripping with a thick, patronizing sweetness that was far more insulting than any curse. "I think you might be in the wrong place. The officers' club is across the base. They have Chardonnay, much more your speed." The woman's eyes lifted to meet his. They were a cool, clear gray, the color of a winter sky over the ocean. There was no fear in them, no anger, no surprise. There was nothing but a calm, analytical light, as if she were examining a curious specimen of deep-sea fauna that had washed ashore. "I'm fine right here, thank you," she said. Her voice was as unremarkable as the rest of her, level, quiet, devoid of any discernible accent or emotion. It was the voice of a GPS navigator, stating a fact. Jensen's smirk widened. The beast was talking back. "Good. See, I don't think you are," he continued, leaning down, placing his hands flat on her small table. He was well inside her personal space now, a tactic designed to intimidate, to use his physical presence as a weapon. The smell of beer and masculine sweat washed over her. "This is a place for a certain type of person. A type of person who has earned the right to be here. A type of person who understands the culture. You," he said, drawing the word out, "are not that type of person." The narrator, had he been a physical presence, would have paused here. He would have pointed out the catastrophic failure of assessment occurring in that moment. He would have explained that Lieutenant Commander Jensen, a man trained to assess threats in milliseconds, a man whose life depended on reading subtle cues in the human and physical environment, was committing an error of such magnitude it would be studied for years to come. He was a geologist tapping on a dormant supervolcano with a rock hammer, utterly oblivious to the planet-altering magma chamber boiling just beneath the surface. He saw a civilian woman. He saw weakness. He saw an easy target for his casual cruelty. He did not see the architect of the very ground he stood upon. The woman did not lean back. She did not shrink from his invasion of her space. Her gaze remained locked on his, steady and unwavering. "And what type of person is that, Lieutenant Commander?" she asked. The use of his rank startled him. It wasn't said with deference. It was said with the same flat, factual tone she had used before, as if she were reading it off a name tag. But he was not wearing a name tag. He was in civilian clothes, just as she was. The fact that she knew his rank, that she had identified him, should have been a warning flare, a signal that his initial assessment was flawed. But in the clouded judgment of his own hubris, he interpreted it as a challenge. She was trying to use his own status against him. "That's need to know, ma'am," he chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "And you don't have the clearance." His team snickered behind him. It was a good line. He was proud of it. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Your assumption that I lack the requisite clearance is based on incomplete and biased data," she stated. It was not a defense. It was a correction. It was a professor pointing out a flaw in a student's logic. This was too much. The academic language, the utter refusal to be intimidated, the sheer galling nerve of her. He felt a surge of hot, raw anger. He was Raptor Jensen. He had hunted men in the dark and brought his team home. He would not be condescended to by some pencil pusher in a gray sweater. He straightened up, his hand sweeping out and accidentally knocking her glass of water from the table. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and violent in the suddenly silent bar. Water and shards of glass spread across the dark wood. "Clumsy me," he said, his voice devoid of any apology. "You should be more careful where you leave your things." The entire bar was quiet now. The other patrons, a mix of off-duty sailors, Marines, and a few other special operators, all turned to watch. This had crossed a line from casual hazing to outright, aggressive bullying. It was ugly, and it made them uncomfortable. But no one moved to intervene. Jensen was a known quantity, a senior figure in the community. The woman was a nobody. The politics of the moment were clear. The woman looked down at the shattered glass on the floor. Then she looked back up at him. The unnerving calm was still there, but it had hardened. The winter sky in her eyes had frozen over, becoming glacial ice. She did not raise her voice. She did not change her expression. She simply spoke, and her words, though quiet, landed in the silent room with the force of hammer blows. "You have made a mistake, Lieutenant Commander," she said. Before Jensen could formulate a retort, a sound from the world outside the bar's thick walls intruded, a sound that changed everything. It started as a low moan, a distant, mournful cry that seemed to come from the very air itself. Within seconds, it rose in pitch and volume, becoming a shrieking, deafening siren that clawed at the ears and vibrated through the floorboards. The typhoon warning, Condition 1. The storm that had been a menacing swirl on satellite maps for days, the beast lurking over the horizon, had accelerated. It was no longer coming. It was here. The crisis arrived not as a creeping dread, but as a physical blow. The lights in the bar flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into a momentary, terrifying blackness before the emergency backup generators kicked in with a guttural roar, casting everything in a stark, sterile, greenish-white light. Simultaneously, the wind hit the building like a solid object. The thick windows of the tavern groaned, the sound of stressed glass a high, keening counterpoint to the howling gale outside. Rain, driven almost horizontally, began to machine gun against the panes. The world outside the small, insulated shrine had devolved into primordial chaos. Every man in the bar who wore a uniform, or had ever worn one, was on his feet. The atmosphere of beery lethargy evaporated, replaced by the crackling ozone of ingrained training. Phones were snatched up. Pagers, for those senior enough to still carry them, screamed with priority alerts. The men from Jensen's team were already moving toward the door, their expressions grim, their earlier mirth forgotten. The game was over. A real-world, life-or-death mission had just begun. Jensen, his petty conflict with the woman instantly relegated to triviality, turned to follow his men. "Let's go," he barked, his voice already in command mode. "Report to the armory, full storm gear, then rally at the piers. All assets need to be secured." But the alerts chirping on his own phone told a story far more complex than just battening down the hatches. It wasn't just the base that was at risk. It was Project Chimera. Chimera was a name spoken only in whispers, a developmental submersible that was less a boat and more a piece of bleeding-edge strategic sorcery. It was an unmanned, deep-diving intelligence platform worth an estimated $3 billion, packed with sensor technology that was 2 decades ahead of its time. It was the Navy's Ghost, a key to underwater dominance that didn't officially exist, and it was currently moored at Pier 7, undergoing its final systems integration in a specialized cradle, dangerously exposed to the full fury of the open sea. Standard procedure called for it to be moved into the reinforced submarine pens in a Condition 3 warning. But the storm's sudden, violent acceleration had outpaced the protocol. Moving it now, in the teeth of a Category 4 typhoon, was impossible. Securing it where it sat was their only option, and it was a desperate one. On the pier, the scene was one of controlled, escalating panic. The wind was a physical entity, a monstrous, invisible hand that shoved and tore at everything. It ripped the words from men's mouths, making shouted commands useless. Rain, cold and hard as pellets of ice, drove into their faces, blurring vision. The sea, normally a placid bay, was a churning cauldron of black, mountainous waves that crashed over the pier, sweeping away equipment and threatening to buckle the very concrete under their feet. The massive floating dry dock cradle holding the sleek, matte black form of the Chimera was straining against its moorings. The 12-inch thick titanium composite cables that held it fast were groaning, vibrating with a low, terrifying thrum, the sound of metal nearing its breaking point. One of the primary hydraulic tensioners on the forward port side had already failed, its warning light a frantic red strobe in the maelstrom. The cradle was beginning to list, slamming the priceless submersible against its support struts with sickening, percussive impacts. Lieutenant Commander Jensen and his SEALs arrived to this chaos, joining the frantic efforts of the base engineers and dock workers. They were men of action, men who solved problems with force and disciplined violence. They threw their weight against winches. They tried to attach secondary cables. They shouted solutions that were immediately swallowed by the storm. But this was not a problem that could be solved with brute force. This was a problem of physics, of hydrodynamics, of catastrophic systems failure under extreme environmental stress. Their conventional methods were like trying to stop a tidal wave with a handful of sand. They were strong, they were brave, and they were utterly, comprehensively failing. Jensen watched, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach, as another wave, larger than the last, smashed against the pier. The Chimera cradle lurched violently, and a sound like a giant's bone snapping echoed over the wind's roar. A second mooring point had sheared off. The cradle was now held by a thread, twisting and bucking in the violent water, threatening to capsize and send $3 billion of national security to the bottom of the bay. The base's chief engineer, a man with 20 years of experience, screamed into his radio, his face a mask of despair. "It's no good. We're going to lose her. All personnel, fall back! Fall back!" Panic began to ripple through the men. They were warriors, not engineers. They were trained to face enemies made of flesh and blood, not the impersonal, overwhelming mathematics of a typhoon. They began to give ground, to retreat from the collapsing pier, their faces etched with the bitter failure of their efforts. Jensen stood frozen for a moment, watching the cradle list at a terrifying 45-degree angle. He had failed. His team had failed. They were about to lose one of the nation's most vital strategic assets on his watch. The humiliation he had so casually inflicted on the woman in the bar was nothing compared to the professional abyss that was now opening at his feet. And then, through the chaos, a new figure appeared on the pier. It was the woman from the bar. She had moved from the tavern to the heart of the storm with a speed that was inexplicable. She wore a standard-issue, high-visibility rain slicker over her gray sweater, its hood pulled up. But there was no mistaking the impossible calm of her demeanor. While everyone else was shouting, she was silent. While everyone else was scrambling in frantic, wasted motion, she moved with a fluid, economical grace, her steps sure and certain on the bucking, water-slicked concrete. She did not seem to be fighting the wind. She seemed to be part of it, flowing through it. She walked directly to the main control station for the mooring system, a console that the chief engineer had just abandoned as useless. Her arrival was so unexpected, so bizarre, that for a moment, the men around her simply stopped and stared. Jensen saw her and felt a jolt of disbelief, followed by a surge of renewed anger. What in God's name was she doing here? A civilian, in the middle of a catastrophic emergency. "Ma'am, you need to get out of here. This is a restricted area," he bellowed, his voice raw from shouting over the wind. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge his existence. Her attention was entirely focused on the damaged control console. Her hands, which he had dismissed as the soft, useless hands of an academic, flew across the control panel. But she wasn't just pushing buttons. She was bypassing the fried primary interface, her fingers finding a maintenance port and jacking in a small, ruggedized tablet she produced from a pocket in the slicker. Code, dense and incomprehensible, scrolled across the tablet's screen at a dizzying speed. The chief engineer, seeing what she was doing, rushed over. "What are you doing? That system is fried. The primary logic board is flooded." The woman did not look up from her tablet. "The primary board is a redundant system," she said, her voice impossibly clear and steady amidst the hurricane's scream. "The core processing unit is housed in a triple-sealed titanium casing, slaved to the tertiary bus. You're trying to fly the plane from the passenger's seat. I am accessing the cockpit." Her fingers stopped moving. She looked up from the tablet, not at the men around her, but at the churning sea, at the tilting cradle, at the groaning cables. Her gray eyes, which had seemed so placid in the bar, were now filled with a terrifying, incandescent intelligence. She was not just looking at the chaos, she was reading it. She was processing wave sets, calculating tensile loads, and running 1,000 complex differential equations in her head. Then she began to speak. And the world changed. "You!" she said, her voice cutting through the gale with the precision of a laser, pointing a finger at a stunned group of SEALs, Jensen's men among them. "I need a 4-man team. You, and you." She had picked out the 4 strongest men without a moment's hesitation. Go to the aft winch assembly. It is a manual override Model 7 Gamma. It requires a 400-pound-foot torque to engage. You will apply that torque counterclockwise for exactly 12 seconds when I give the command. Not 11, not 13, 12. Do you understand? The men, shocked into obedience by the sheer, unassailable authority in her voice, simply nodded and ran to their position. "Chief," she said to the bewildered engineer, "your secondary tensioner on the starboard bow is operational, but its governor is malfunctioning, limiting it to 50% capacity. I am shunting control to this terminal. I am going to overclock it to 140% for a 3-second burst. It will likely destroy the motor, but it will hold. Be prepared to vent the hydraulics manually on my mark." The chief, his jaw slack with astonishment, could only stammer, "But that's not in any manual." The manual did not anticipate a resonance cascade in the primary gyroscopic stabilizer induced by a cyclonic wavefront, she replied without blinking. The manual is irrelevant. She turned her attention to Jensen. For the first time on the pier, she made eye contact with him. The glacial ice was still there, but now it was burning with a cold fire. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, the title now sounding less like a rank and more like a specimen label. "Your team is trained in small unit hydrographic insertion, correct?" "Yes," he managed to say, the word feeling small and inadequate in his own mouth. "Good," she said, turning back to her tablet. "There is an exposed maintenance conduit on the ventral surface of the cradle, 12 o'clock from the primary keel line. It is 3 meters below the waterline. Inside is a manual release valve for the ballast tanks. I need 2 of your men to enter the water, access that conduit, and open the valve. The valve requires a 180-degree turn. It will be difficult in this current." Jensen stared at her, horrified. "Send my men into that water? That's a death sentence. They'll be crushed between the cradle and the pier." She looked up at him again, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was pity. The kind of pity a master chess player feels for an opponent who can only see one move ahead. "There will be a window," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. In approximately 93 seconds, the 7th wave of the current harmonic set will strike the forward breakwater. The resulting backwash will create a temporary null current zone on the leeward side of the cradle. That zone will last for 19 seconds. That is their window. They will have ample time to access the conduit, open the valve, and return to the pier before the undertow returns. Now give the order, Commander." Jensen was paralyzed. Everything she said was insane. Predicting wave patterns to the second, a null current zone, it was the stuff of science fiction. But as he looked at the dying, multi-billion-dollar asset, at the faces of his men looking to him for orders, and then back at the impossible certainty on this woman's face, he felt his own authority, his own reality, begin to dissolve. He was out of his depth. He was a child in a world of arcane forces he could not comprehend. And she was the only one who seemed to understand the language of the storm. He keyed his comms. "Corman Daniels, you heard the lady? On her mark, you go." He didn't know why he obeyed. He just did. The woman's eyes were fixed on the black, raging water, her head cocked as if listening to a distant symphony. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The cradle groaned, listing further. A piece of the pier broke away and was swallowed by the waves. The men tensed, their knuckles white. "SEAL team, stand by," she said, her voice calm. "Chief, prepare to vent." She watched the sea. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, mark! A wave of truly monstrous proportions, exactly as she had predicted, slammed into the breakwater with the force of an artillery barrage. The pier shuddered, and then, for a few miraculous seconds, the water around the cradle seemed to calm, the violent chop replaced by an eerie, swirling stillness. "Go!" she commanded. Corman and Daniels, two of Jensen's best men, dove into the black water without hesitation, disappearing beneath the surface. "Aft winch! Engage! Now!" she shouted into her comms. The 4 SEALs on the winch threw their entire weight against the override, their muscles straining. The winch screamed in protest, but began to turn. "Chief, vent hydraulics! Now!" The engineer, his face a mask of terrified awe, slammed his hand down on the manual release. A geyser of hydraulic fluid erupted from the starboard tensioner as it went into a controlled, suicidal overload. For a few breathtaking seconds, a symphony of impossible physics played out. The aft winch pulled, the starboard tensioner fired, and deep below the surface, the ballast tanks began to flood. The massive cradle, which had been twisting to port, groaned, shuddered, and then slowly, miraculously, began to right itself. It settled back into the water, lower now, more stable, its center of gravity completely altered. The 19-second window was closing. The null current zone was collapsing. "They're not back!" Jensen screamed. "Wait!" she said, her eyes still on the water. Just as the undertow began to surge again, 2 heads broke the surface near the pier ladder. Corman and Daniels. They scrambled up, gasping, their faces pale but alive. They had done it. The cradle was stable. The Chimera was secure. The storm still raged, but the battle for Pier 7 had been won. It had been won not by brute force, not by the men of action, but by the quiet, inexplicable woman with the gray sweater and the tablet. The SEALs, the engineers, the dock workers, they all stood motionless, drenched and exhausted, staring at her. They had not been soldiers in a fight. They had been scalpels in the hands of a master surgeon. The sense of awe was palpable, a silence more profound than the roar of the wind. Lieutenant Commander Jensen stood apart from them, his own silence born not of awe, but of a complete and shattering cognitive dissonance. His world had been turned upside down and shaken apart. It was into this tableau of stunned silence and howling wind that a new vehicle appeared, its lights cutting through the rain. A black, up-armored Suburban, the kind used by the highest echelons of command, screeched to a halt at the edge of the pier. The passenger door flew open, and a man stepped out into the storm. He was an older man, his face a road map of wrinkles carved by decades of service and command. He wore no hat, his short-cropped gray hair plastered to his scalp by the rain. Pinned to the collar of his simple utility uniform were the 3 silver stars of a vice admiral. But it was the insignia on his breast that commanded the most respect. The gold trident of a Navy SEAL, tarnished with age and experience. This was Vice Admiral Franklin Wallace, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command himself, a living legend. He strode onto the pier, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the stabilized cradle, the exhausted men, and the controlled chaos. His gaze finally landed on the woman, and the entire world stopped. The admiral, a man who commanded fleets and deployed warriors across the globe, a man before whom generals and senators stood at attention, halted his advance. His back, which had been slightly stooped with age, straightened into a rod of iron. His expression of grim concern melted away, replaced by one of profound, absolute respect. He barked a single, sharp command that cut through the storm like a rifle shot. "On deck!" It was the most fundamental command in the Navy, a call for all present to render respect to a senior officer. Every sailor and SEAL on the pier, including a shell-shocked Lieutenant Commander Jensen, snapped to the position of attention, their bodies rigid, their eyes locked forward. But the Admiral was not looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the woman. He took 3 more precise steps forward, stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her, and executed the sharpest, most respectful salute of his long and storied career. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a subordinate. It was the salute a knight gives to his queen. "Dr. Thorne," the Admiral said, his voice booming with authority but laced with an undeniable reverence, "you are out of uniform." The woman, Dr. Aris Thorne, finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips. "So are you, Frank," she replied, her voice retaining its quiet calm. "I trust you have my diagnostics package." The name descended upon the pier like a physical weight. Thorne. Dr. Aris Thorne. It wasn't a name most of them knew, but for a select few, for the Admiral and for the horrified Chief Engineer, it was a name spoken with the same reverence as Nimitz or Halsey. It was the name of a legend of a different kind. The narrator would have stepped forward here, his voice low and reverent, to fill in the blanks that were now exploding in the minds of the men on the pier. Dr. Aris Thorne was not a clerk. She was not a historian. She was the director of the Office of Naval Research's Asymmetric Warfare Division. Her doctorate wasn't in sociology. It was in quantum hydrodynamics and advanced materials science from Caltech. The gray sweater and plain trousers were her uniform, the uniform of a Tier 1 civilian asset, whose clearance level was so high it didn't have a name. She was the lead architect and chief designer of Project Chimera. She knew how to save it from the storm because she had designed the storm simulations it had been built to withstand. She hadn't been sitting in the bar, calculating the integrity of the stool. She had been running a final mental diagnostic of the submersible's resonant frequencies, a task she preferred to do in an environment with ambient, predictable background noise. She knew Jensen's rank because she had memorized the entire command roster of the SEAL team assigned to her project's security detail. She was not in their world. They were, and had always been, in hers. The Admiral held his salute, waiting for her to dismiss it. Lieutenant Commander Jensen, still frozen at attention, felt a cold sweat break out on his skin that had nothing to do with the rain. The woman he had bullied, the civilian he had humiliated, the nobody whose drink he had intentionally spilled, was a figure of such immense authority that the commander of his entire branch of the service was saluting her in the middle of a typhoon. The floor had not just fallen out from under his world, the entire planet had vanished, leaving him spinning in a black void of his own catastrophic ignorance. Dr. Thorne gave a slight nod to the Admiral. "As you were, Frank." The Admiral dropped his salute. The other men relaxed from their rigid posture, though the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Thorne's gaze, now devoid of any fire, swept over the assembled men. It was cool, analytical, and deeply weary. It finally came to rest on Lieutenant Commander Jensen. He stood before her, stripped bare of his rank, his reputation, his swagger. He was no longer Raptor, the Predator. He was just Michael Jensen, a man who had made a profound and public error. She walked slowly towards him, the wind whipping the yellow slicker around her. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gray in her irises, the color of sea foam on a winter beach. He expected her to shout, to berate him, to have him arrested. He braced himself for the explosion, for the righteous and deserved fury. It never came. Your behavior in the tavern was not a personal insult, Lieutenant Commander, she began, her voice back to its quiet, clinical tone. A personal insult is irrelevant. It was a tactical failure of the first order. She let the words hang in the air, forcing him to absorb them. Your primary function as a special warfare operator, beyond the application of violence, is the rapid and accurate assessment of the operational environment. You are trained to identify assets, threats, and unknowns, and to act on that intelligence. Tonight, you encountered an unknown variable. Instead of observing, gathering intelligence, and re-evaluating, you defaulted to a preconceived bias. You saw a woman in civilian clothes, and your assessment was non-threat, irrelevant, dismissible. You applied a filter of prejudice to your tactical analysis. She took a small step closer. That faulty analysis led you to engage in a course of action, provocation, and intimidation that served no strategic purpose. It was a waste of energy and focus. More critically, it revealed a profound flaw in your judgment. Had I been an enemy intelligence operative gathering information, which, given my appearance, was a far more logical possibility than lost accountant, you would have exposed your team's disposition, your own command style, and a critical vulnerability, that your judgment can be compromised by your ego. Every word was a perfectly placed scalpel, dissecting his failure with surgical precision. It wasn't about his rudeness. It was about his incompetence. He had failed the most basic test of a special operator, to see the world as it is, not as he wished it to be. Your failure to correctly identify me, she continued, her voice dropping even lower, was an inconvenience. Your failure to correctly assess the physics of the crisis on this pier, however, nearly cost this nation a strategic asset beyond valuation. You reverted to brute force when the problem required finesse. You saw a storm, and you tried to punch it. You do not punch the ocean, Commander. You understand it. You adapt to it. Or you die. She paused, letting the weight of his compounding failures settle upon him. He could feel the eyes of his men, of the admiral, of every person on that pier. He had never known a humiliation so complete, so absolute. It was a public vivisection of his professional soul. "I am not going to recommend you for a court-martial," she said, and for a moment, a flicker of desperate relief sparked in his chest. It was immediately extinguished by her next words. A court-martial would be an insufficient and inefficient corrective measure. It would punish you. It would not educate you. She turned to Vice Admiral Wallace. "Frank, I am formally requesting that Lieutenant Commander Jensen be reassigned, effective 0600 tomorrow morning." The Admiral nodded, his expression grim. "To where, Doctor?" Dr. Thorne looked back at Jensen, and for the first time, he saw something new in her eyes. It wasn't pity anymore. It was purpose. "To my personal staff," she declared. "He will serve as my temporary military liaison for the duration of Project Chimera's sea trials. 6 months. He will carry my diagnostic gear. He will sit in my briefings. He will fetch my coffee. He will spend every waking moment of the next 6 months in the presence of a civilian, female, non-threat. His re-education will consist of observing competence in a form he is culturally and instinctively predisposed to dismiss. He will learn that strength is not always loud. He will learn that authority is not always uniformed. And most importantly, he will learn to see the asset, not the package it comes in. He will learn to shut his mouth, open his eyes, and process data before engaging his ego. His punishment will be his enlightenment. A dead silence fell over the pier, broken only by the now lessening howl of the wind. It was a fate worse than any brig time. It was a sentence of prolonged, institutionalized humility, to be served at the right hand of the very person he had so arrogantly despised. He would be a walking cautionary tale for his entire team, for the entire base. The admiral simply said, "Consider it done, Doctor." The legend of that night passed into the annals of naval special warfare lore. It became known as Raptor's Storm, or the lesson on Pier 7. New operators coming into the teams at Coronado would hear the story from grizzled senior enlisted men, a modern military fable about the dangers of hubris. The details would shift with each telling. Sometimes the drink was beer, sometimes it was whiskey. Sometimes she broke his wrist. Other times she simply broke his spirit with a look. But the core truth of the story remained immutable. It became a teaching tool, a verbal simulation run for every arrogant young frogman who thought the trident on his chest made him the measure of all things. Years passed. Lieutenant Commander Michael Jensen completed his 6 months of re-education. He never spoke of it in detail, but the man who returned to the teams was not the man who had left. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful confidence. The loud, booming laugh was replaced by a thoughtful silence. He became one of the most respected and effective team leaders in the command. Not because he was the loudest or the strongest, but because he was the wisest. He learned to listen. He learned to see. A decade after the storm, Captain Michael Jensen stood on the asphalt grinder at the BUD/S training facility. He was an instructor now, a revered and feared figure responsible for forging the next generation of SEALs. He stood before a class of exhausted, shivering candidates, their faces smudged with sand and grime. "You think you're strong because you can push through the surf," he said to them, his voice quiet but carrying across the ranks. "You think you're tough because you can endure this pain. You think that because you are here, you are the elite. You are wrong." He paced before them, his eyes scanning each of their faces. "Let me tell you a story about a real storm and a real test. I once met a person who commanded the wind and the waves not with strength, but with knowledge. A person who faced down chaos not with a weapon, but with a thought. A person who held more power in their quiet mind than my entire SEAL team held in our fists and our rifles." He stopped and looked out towards the ocean. "I made the mistake of judging that person by their cover. I saw a quiet civilian, and I acted like an arrogant fool. And that quiet civilian, that non-threat, took my entire world, broke it down into its component parts, and rebuilt it from the ground up. She taught me that the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest, but the quietest. She taught me that true strength isn't the power to dominate, it's the wisdom to understand. She taught me that respect is not a currency you demand. It is a debt you owe to competence, wherever you find it." He turned back to the students, his gaze hard as steel. "You will forget half of what you learn here. You will forget drills and procedures. But you will remember this. Your ego is a liability. Your assumptions are your enemy. The moment you think you are the smartest, strongest person in the room, you have become the biggest fool. Look for the quiet professional. Find the person who doesn't need to speak. Learn from them. Because in the real world, the fight is not won by the loudest voice. It is won by the clearest mind." And so the lesson of Dr. Aris Thorne, the quiet professional, the hidden master, echoed down through the generations. taught by the very man she had so thoroughly and necessarily humbled. It became more than a story. It became a core tenet of a community that was slowly, painfully learning that the greatest threats are often the ones you refuse to see, and the greatest strength is the humility to admit what you do not know. The moral was simple, and it was eternal. Do not mistake the stillness of the water for a lack of depth, for in the quiet deep, where the loud and the foolish cannot go, lie the currents that truly shape the world.